8 years later, Promethean Uplift Project plus 34. One of the artifacts I brought back with me in my shipping container of Earth tech was a Cosmac Super Elf single-board computer kit built in the 1970s. M had suggested that a simple computer might inspire the Prometheans where more complex, harder-to-duplicate devices would just discourage them. And once they were making their bulky and awkward integrated circuits, they quickly figured out how to make a computer that did the same thing as the Super Elf's RCA 1802 microprocessor. Promethean semiconductor technology didn't naturally lend itself to high speed or density, but 30 years later they were making 1802 clones that ran at 100 megahertz and with a new 16-bit architecture that cleanly ran older 8-bit programs. M had tried to suggest that other architectures could be more useful, but the Prometheans had never had Alan Turing to tell them that all such machines are basically the same, and they were reluctant to make a large body of existing work obsolete by changing the platform on which it ran. We were invited to inspect a prototype of what they thought might be a practical Starship data system. M, who had written more than a little software back in the day, took a keen interest and spent hours discussing the operation of the new 32-bit 1802 clone with its developers. The computer had a gas-discharge backlit graphical LCD display, and while it was monochrome and the pixels were easily visible, there were a lot of pixels because it was almost 2 meters across. It was actually made of tiled modules about 10 centimeters square, so it could be made arbitrarily large. They demonstrated maps being updated in real time as we flew over a virtual landscape, and it was clear they were quite proud of themselves. After 3 days of evaluation and 2 more spent crunching numbers furiously in private, M announced that it would work. I hate to admit it, but this thing can do what they need. What do you wish they had done differently? She put down her pencil and leaned back. Almost everything, she said. It's an awkward mess and not really amenable to string handling and therefore advanced compiler design, which would make everything a lot easier going forward. She sat up. But it will work. I have to give them that. They will do 10 hours of work for every hour we did coming up with software for it. But I suspect what they end up with will be a lot more thoroughly vetted and reliable than ours. That sounds like a feature, not a bug. She snorted. You might be right about that. The Prometheans won't be listening to music or watching videos on their computers, but human computers were a lot more reliable when we weren't doing those things either. The computer was a surprise, but a bigger surprise was why the Prometheans felt they needed it. On the advice of the computer people, we visited another electronics lab. We have been working on the next level of fold technology after levitation and gravity plates. Those do not require focusing and just harvest gravitons across a local probability field. The next step would be something that focuses but is also limited to some form of radiation. The 2 main candidates are your supergravity drive and the microfold, which is used for galactic communication. But you have a microfold terminal. You've been using it for tens of thousands of years to reassure the Curators that you are okay. And we would like to melt it down into slag. But the only way we can safely do that is to replace it with one of our own making. And that requires us to be able to engage the Galactic Message Transfer Protocol. That doesn't require what you would consider a high level of computer power. After all, most of the Curated do it with nanite-based computers, which we understand are liquefied garbage compared to yours. But our older designs still were not up to the task. This new 32-bit version is... You'll still need the software, M said skeptically. We've been working on that by recording traffic and decoding it in artificially slowed time on a 16-bit machine. We obviously can't respond with our own messages, but we can write and test the code which extracts messages and identifies our response slot. Now that we have the 32-bit machine, we think we can be on the network with our own hardware in a couple of months. It actually took them 3 months, but we soon found ourselves traveling to observe the ceremony as the Prometheans melted their hated nanite-based galactic nanny. Traffic on the network had largely been congratulatory as they announced their presence to the general galactic population for the first time. We joined the leader of the Microfold lab to watch the ceremony. I didn't think there was any way you could get the software working so quickly, M said as we watched the nanite microfold transceiver start to melt. The lab director said, "Behold the power of Forth." "The Forth what?" I said. "Not Forth the sequence, Forth the computer language. It is compact, fast on hardware designed with it in mind. It's the reason our new machine has multiple hardware stacks, and interactive, so it facilitates very rapid design and accurate, incrementally tested coding." The Galactic Terminal software was mostly complete before we took delivery of the 32-bit prototype and connected it to our experimental microfold interface. "I've seen a couple of Forth projects," M said. "We call it write-only software because you can't look at a program and figure out what it does. But you usually don't have to. The computer does, and it turns out the computer is very good at that. So some being with access to Earth technology must have introduced you to this concept. There is actually a chapter on threaded interpretive languages in one of the computer books you brought here in your shipping container. It contains a summary of the core fourth primitives and a practical example of an inner interpreter. We figured out long ago that would be our fastest and easiest path beyond machine language. It was designed when your own computers were much more primitive to make maximum use of limited hardware. What have we done? M said with a sigh. You have opened another gateway for us on a path that leads out into the galaxy. Begin article for immediate release via microfold relay scope. All galaxy section Galactic Mysteries. Origin Norma R 1843 Curator Index 829166 Translation. Note names with no recorded Earth equivalents are given Greek placeholders according to current Earth CI 1742660 Directive. Title: An old voice finally has something to say. Byline: Alpha 70,000 years ago, the Curators quietly inserted a new world into their index, in the thick of the Norma galactic arm. It was removed from the quarantine list and, as is usual, began to show up in the microfold transaction relay, acknowledging that there was a working microfold transceiver there and that it had an operator. And for 70,000 years, that's all it ever did. I actually traveled to an archivist world that keeps the best records, to be sure, and did an electronic search. All CI 829166 has ever had to say to the rest of the galaxy is ACK. Yes, we are here, but they have never asked for any further discourse with the rest of us, at least until last month. In a galaxy with more than 1 million inhabited worlds, there are going to be some oddballs, but few have made themselves as enduringly mysterious as CI 829166. 5 fold ships have investigated, all finding from orbit evidence of a primitive society with no obvious infrastructure and no means of providing orbital transfer support. Until recently, that also meant no way to land and investigate. So to this day, we have no idea what the inhabitants of CI 829166 look like, or why they have maintained their generational silence so completely. One hint might come from their first message. In the comment field of the transfer protocol, which they had never used before, they placed the message, "We made this ourselves without using nanites." There was also, for the first time, a content request packet, asking for an up-to-date and complete introduction to the most current version of the Galactic Common Language. Needless to say, that reply was transmitted on the very next cycle. It also directed everyone's attention toward another world, Earth CI 1742660, which burst onto the galactic stage within the last century with their own non-nanite-based technology implementing tiny starships and powerful energy weapons. All inquiries toward Earth have been met with insistent denial. They have no record of anyone from Earth or any of their colonies ever visiting CI 829166. They insist they didn't even know what a mystery it was in some circles because, as one official put it, why would we care? Unfortunately, it is the humans of Earth who are best equipped to investigate CI 829166, but they are also strongly implicated as the players who kicked 829166 out of its technological somnolescence. Negotiations are ongoing, but as their role in galactic trade has increased, humans have given up the habit they once had of making very tiny explorational starships like the infamous Grasshopper and Horsepill. The humans have to take a productive starship out of service for at least a week to make an expedition to the Norma arm of the galaxy. And while other races now have starships that can land, those are all huge nanite-based designs that might be a bit threatening if they approach the surface of any world uninvited. Meanwhile, having gotten their dictionary, the natives of 829166 have been gradually extending their command of both the language and the transfer protocol in a way that makes it very believable that they really have built their own terminal from first principles. The thing nobody can figure out is, if they have been so stubbornly incommunicative since their first days out of quarantine, how did they know enough common to make their initial request? End article. As was our tradition, the human form curator had brought a welcome fifth of Johnny Walker Blue. "Your people aren't coming yet," he said as we clinked shot glasses. "But they will come." "We are far from finished here," M said, and I nodded. "My people are in agreement. We do not want to see your work here stop. But you have seeded it well, and a little vacation might be a good idea while this introduction kerfluffle works itself out. The Prometheans just didn't realize what they were doing when they decided to say hello." "So where should we vacate?" M asked. "So the safest place would be with the witnesses, since they know your secret anyway." "That asshole Q who tried to destroy their world is also staying with them," she said as she spat on the ground. "We had an idea about that," the curator said. "You probably won't like it much, but please hear me out. It offers little risk, keeps you away from Q except for a few hours, and gives him a chance to prove he is not what you remember him to be." M wasn't happy about it at all. But try as she might, she couldn't think of a valid reason to turn the proposal down. So a week later we found ourselves on the plausible deniability with both the curator and Q, traveling back from the witness's world to Prometheus. M was doing a slow burn, but she was carrying out the plan. I would have brought him myself, but I don't have an amplifier belt, the curator said apologetically. By the time the situation escalates to a point where such an item might be released, it could easily be too late to help. I appreciate the ride, Q said. Don't thank me, I'm just driving the jalopy, M said in a voice dripping with venom. Look, I can't change what I once was. Please consider at least the possibility that I have changed and consider how I might prove it to you. An heroic death would do nicely, M said. That is a distinct possibility, the curator said. Q is going to provide a cover story for you, and there is some risk to him in doing so. We will not be able to provide cover for him. Fine, we'll see, M said. I don't see how that could possibly work, I said. Me and my bros were just trashing around the galaxy when we got in an argument and they dumped me on this dipshit world I eventually named Prometheus, Q said in an eerie return to his pre-Enlightenment speech mannerisms. Haven't seen them since and don't know where the ship is now. Oh, the illegal ship with the fold drive that was supposed to be destroyed. You guys might be real interested in who I used to work for. So here I was on this primitive dump and they figured I'd never make my way back to the galaxy again. But turns out these Promethean dudes are pretty hip to tech that they are able to make themselves, so I gave them a little help. Pretty slick, I said. But the people who are after all of us might come for you. I know. Maybe M will get her heroic death before this is over. If so, I'm okay with that. This is pretty high profile on human worlds for the moment, the curator said. It would be quite risky for them to pull anything on the recon visit. And with this ship gone, we think it might be a bit difficult for them to justify another clandestine run to try and extract Q. If they haven't tried in a month or two, it will almost certainly indicate a lack of will. It's costing them a fair amount of revenue to sideline a ship for this visit. And there is almost exactly zero profit for anybody to make by repeating it. And one thing Earth is still all about is money. Even our colonies think they're crazy now, Q finished. Yeah, we should wake up and smell the nanites, M said, finally finding something to complain about other than Q. An hour later we had dropped Q off and were on our way back to the witnesses. Okay, M said, now that she could breathe a little easier. What do you think the chances are of this stupid plan succeeding? Well, on the point of giving you cover so you can come back safely in a few months and continue your work here, we are pretty sure it will work. His presence will neatly explain what happened here, and there is no reason for anyone to come back once that explanation is in place until the Prometheans are in a position to trade on their own. That is unlikely to happen for at least 30 or 40 more years, even at their highly accelerated rate of development. So I guess Q will be vacationing with the witnesses for a while afterward. Not really. There are 7 more unaccounted for fold drives, and we are sure there must be other ships like this one. They will almost certainly send an extraction crew after him. Q is well versed in how his former masters think. Q is himself well trained, but his heart is not into violence as it was when he was a highly effective commando. I consider his chances of surviving this less than 10%. Does he know this? M asked. His estimate is less than 5%. Yay for Q then, M said with a heavy sigh, and we made the rest of the trip back to the witnesses in silence. 6 months later. Still Promethean Uplift Project plus 34 begin article for immediate release via microfold relay scope. Earth and Human Colonies section. Humanity, fuck yeah. Origin, Norma R. 1843, Curator Index 829166. Title, A Real-Life Robinson Crusoe Returns Home. Byline, Associated Colonial Press. This quiet world, a third of the way around the galactic wheel from Earth, became a subject of interest this year when, after 70,000 years of stubborn rejection of Curator technology, the natives developed an independent link to the microfold network on their own. Here, with the crew of the Trinity-class fold ship Prospero's books, we found the cause of this world's sudden technological uplift, a world that is no longer nameless. When I realized what I had to do, I started calling this place Prometheus, Q said. He is a relatively young man with a fondness for cultural references a bit beyond his apparent years, and surprisingly fresh, Earth-like attire. The Prometheans are great makers, he says. They have really been on the cusp of doing this for all these thousands of years. It just took a little push. I showed up with a couple of the keys they needed in my head, and they did the rest even quicker than we humans did. They just don't like the lack of control you accept when using nanites, since nobody except the curators really knows how nanites themselves work. But when I showed up here, I knew what was possible because I knew humans had done it. As to how he ended up on the world he named, Q has a story that will set investigators running all over the galaxy. There were 8 fold drives humans made that were capable of folding a planet into its star, before we figured out how to lock that out, he told us. They were supposed to be destroyed, despite their potential value after the legendary M&J witnessed just such an event firsthand. But according to Q, would you really think something as valuable as a fold drive would just be melted down? And because they were being diverted illegally, the people who got them were not the best. Q will not talk about how he was recruited or the missions he ran before becoming marooned. We had a lot of freedom, he said, being basically mercenaries. We were trashing around the galaxy, doing what we were told when called and otherwise doing whatever. One day my buddies decided to visit this obscure world which was off the quarantine list, but had no commerce with the rest of the galaxy. Next thing I know, my crew has left without me. In retrospect, I realized my first mate was almost certainly banging my girl, and in those days I would have killed them both if I had found out. What do you mean in those days? One of our reporters asked. 20 years on an alien world will change your perspective, he said. Today I hope they're happy. And now they also have your fold ship? I suppose. I have no idea where it is. And I don't suppose it was ever really my fold ship anyway. The people who hired us probably considered it's theirs. The investigation team is wrapping up its work here, where the Prometheans have already built anti-gravity air cars and may be making their own fold drives within a decade or two. When the report is complete, it will be made available to the galactic community. We still do not know the fate of Q's fold ship, or the others he suspects were illegally made with the drives that were supposed to be scrapped, and more investigations have already begun on Earth following those accusations. The Prometheans have been sending ACK to the microfold network for tens of thousands of years, one of our researchers reminded Q. Why didn't you just get them to send a message for you? They had sabotaged the nanite transmitter they hated so much so that no more advanced communication was possible, he answered. My only hope was to get them to the point where they could call for help by some other means they would be willing to actually use. The team has talked extensively with the Prometheans who have verified every element of Q's story in detail. We will be leaving soon and closing a mystery that has perplexed the galaxy. End article. What the actual fuck? Em said after she scanned the printout. Is there a single truthful thing in this whole pile of horse shit? Not really, the human form curator said. And that is by design. The design of taking credit for all of our work? If you take credit for your work on Prometheus, the people you think are after you will know where to find you. She closed her eyes. So do you believe they are really still after us? Probably so. That would mean Q is taking a large risk. The people who once employed him know many of those statements are lies too. But something has to explain to the galaxy how and why the Prometheans surged forward just when they did. Almost in the footsteps of humans. You do not want to be that explanation yourselves right now. I think I'm done with this, Em said. I don't see how I can keep going forward. This would be an odd time to give up, the curator said. And why is that? Now that the crisis is passing, the Prometheans are very eager to show you their first spaceship. Spaceship? How can they have a spaceship? They don't have a drive. They don't have a fold drive, but they do have supergravity, as well as control and navigation systems you've seen. They have built a small ship to test their ideas on space-based systems and explore their solar system. It won't be capable of interstellar travel, but should be able to reach any world in their solar system within a matter of days. What about life support? I understand they have a fairly advanced plan for that. But we hadn't really heard anything about work on life support systems, and he wouldn't give details when pressed. We had to wait for the Earth expedition to depart Prometheus anyway, and were only mildly surprised that Q went with them. We gave it a couple more months to blow over before returning to Prometheus ourselves. By then, there was a general galactic consensus that the Prometheans should be left alone unless they asked for more company, and human news agencies reported that the galactic Robinson Crusoe Q had decided to settle in one of the larger cities on the rustic human colony world of Pretoria. The Prometheans had created thousands of research facilities to drive their progress, ranging from little shops investigating radio techniques to sprawling complexes devoted to mass manufacturing electronic circuit plates. In the beginning, we had made an effort to visit them all once in a while, but it became impossible. And some of them did not want us to visit. They didn't want us to just give them human technology. They wanted enough hints to figure out how to do it themselves, but in a way that made sense to them, so that they could implement on their own. The shipworks was one of those. We had known they were planning to build it, but we did not know they had actually got to the point of building a ship. As we approached the coordinates we were given in the plausible deniability, we were puzzled to find the site dominated by a 3-story tall spherical greenhouse. We were greeted warmly and Em asked where the ship was. This resulted in some of the coughing fits we recognized as Promethean laughter. "Surely you couldn't miss it on your approach," one of the techs said. "It's the tallest structure here. The terrarium is your ship? One habit we have decided to adopt from your people is the naming of our spacecraft. This first one is called the Gift of Guidance. As a race that lives in small groups and values parenting and teaching, we have a neutral excuse for choosing such a name, but of course it is your guidance we specifically celebrate." It was indeed a huge glass sphere with 5 glass landing fins and a boarding tube taking the place of what would have been a 6th. It had 3 decks, clearly visible, all also apparently made of glass. "It's Cinderella's spaceship," I said brightly, and M gave me a nasty look. "We showed you metalworking techniques," M said. "Why in the world would you use glass for the hull? Our hull is 20 centimeters thick and tempered. We calculate that any projectile that could breach it would go through even your toughest metal-hulled ships like tissue paper." We boarded. The lowest level was engineering and navigation. This is where the computers were, in a circle around the perimeter. Since it was near the bottom of the spherical hull, it was small, with a 2-meter-wide working area between the perimeter instrumentation and the spiral staircase in the center that gave access to the upper decks. We have 3 onboard 32-bit computers for redundancy and parallelism. Any of them can do any job, including control of the multiplex drive, the ranging radar, life support, and power distribution. How big is this thing? The hull is 12 meters in diameter. Lithium batteries and stores are below this engineering deck. There is a space about 1.5 meters deep there. If you look straight up, you can see the multiplex drive in the center of the hull sphere. It's about 1 meter in diameter, so about 10 times the mass of your supergravity drive. Why do you call it a multiplex drive? It isn't just a supergravity drive. It has multiple functions. Since it was going to be fairly large no matter what, we realized that adding just a bit more functionality could give it some other very useful functions without making it that much bigger. That has made some other systems simpler or even unnecessary. What else does it do? Well, it can selectively fold all wavelengths of photons. We can use it directly as a heater if we're in the outer system too far from the sun. And while it can't fold electrons since they have mass, it can fold photons into the center of a dense photovoltaic array and generate about 10 kilowatts of electricity for the artificial lighting and computer systems, and of course to charge the batteries for when the drive is offline. We had wanted to use it for area illumination, but we realized we can only control the size of the aperture, not its transparency. So we have to keep it very small for safety when it's folded to the center of a star. We ascended the staircase, which was supported by 6 glass columns about 10 centimeters in diameter, around a 3-meter diameter core defined by the columns and holes in the top 2 decks. The second deck was just below the equator of the sphere, and the staircase brought us to a pathway through the vegetation. The multiplex drive was supported by 3 stalks anchored in the columns opposite the stairway at that level. The main path on this level circumnavigates the hull and leads to sleeping hammocks. The elimination facilities are also located on this level, with the vegetation providing some privacy. We don't do a lot of complicated recycling on board. We depend on returning to a habitable world to restore the atmosphere and water systems to equilibrium. As she spoke, another Promethean approached from the thicket. "Oh, they're here," he said. "Sorry, but I was a bit busy with last-minute details." "This is our ship's botanist," our guide said. "You might prefer to think of him as our life support engineer." "We gave you designs for life support systems," M said a bit plaintively. "Yes, and they were very clever. Also very difficult. Exotic materials, toxic and caustic chemicals, high-temperature processes, all stuff we had not been working on. But we have been farming for almost 100,000 years and we know our biome well. The mechanical schemes required pressurized oxygen and resources to scrub carbon dioxide, which were either very complicated or used expensive consumables. And there are other things the biome does which your life support systems don't do. We do use your methods for our EVA suits, but there we accept a lot of limitations. We tried this once on Earth, you know," M said. "It didn't work out too well." "Of course, Biosphere too," the botanist nodded. "It lasted, about 2 months before they were accused of cheating?" "Something like that. Fortunately, we don't anticipate ever being sealed up for more than a week or 2, and never even that long once we have the fold drive. Our design goal for this system is a crew of 10, 3 engineers and up to 7 passengers, for a tour long enough to visit every planet of our system. But the biome could support 60 for as much as a week in an emergency, with bright sunlight for the biome. It can support the design crew indefinitely, at least for oxygen generation on the onboard artificial lighting. These plants do okay in variable lighting conditions? Oh yes, we've been farming for a very long time and not with your industrial methods. We know our native biome very well. We ascended to the third level, which was open to the sky. Here, the navigation walkway follows the inside core guardrail instead of the perimeter, and we have a couple of observation and entertainment areas. This is where we do food preparation with an electrically powered kitchen, and where we would normally gather to eat or have a meeting. This deck is 11 meters in diameter, but the hull gets quite close to the deck near the perimeter. It feels very solid, Em said. Just how much does this thing weigh? The glass totals 200,000 kilograms. The biome soil, biomass, and support features are another 120,000. All in all, the whole ship masses about 400,000 kilograms. Of course, weight doesn't matter when you have a supergravity drive, because every particle falls through the same acceleration gradient when you maneuver. How in the hell did you build it? I asked. For that you have to go to the engineers. We're just the crew. But they took photographs. The Prometheans had only primitive black and white film photography, and they used it sparingly. But they had devoted a crewman to documenting the process of creating the Gift of Guidance's hull. They had lofted the glass into space as a solid blob 4 meters in diameter, then used the multiplex drive to melt it using the sunlight cannon method. You built a weapon? Em asked. No, we built a furnace, which was your first intended use for the same device. Wearing EVA suits, we used the drive on an open platform space sled to get it high enough to take some time falling. Then used compressed gas pumped in through a steel pipe to blow it into a sphere as your earth glass blowers do. It didn't take a terribly high pressure in the vacuum of space. It's remarkably uniform, Em said. This was our 4th try. We let the others crash into the ocean, the guide said, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. This seems like an awful lot of effort for something that can't leave your home system, Em said as we returned from the engineer's shop. But it's not stuck here, our guide said. We've been in contact via the microfold, and other races assure us they could take us along as their larger ships transfer. It's actually normal for a non-landing orbit-only fold ship to generate a fold aperture much larger than its hull. Now that you mention it, if I needed to, I could even do that with the plausible deniability. We normally keep that ability locked down, but I know how to enable it. And that brings us to our reason for finally inviting you here. You see, we have tested everything as much as we can. We have taken the ship into space and landed it multiple times. But it is our only ship. And if we have made any mistakes, we have no second chances once we are out in the solar system. We have never put it in orbit around Prometheus or taken it as far as the orbit of our moon. We would be grateful if you would accompany us in the plausible deniability on our first voyage, just in case we need backup. We don't have an airlock or docking ring, Em said as I nodded. We know. We plan to make this first trip in EVA suits. We are given to understand that you can evacuate the plausible a couple of times and recharge the atmosphere if necessary. We would only need this in some extreme, dire, unexpected circumstance. You do have a fold drive, which we don't, and that could be much more useful than an airlock. Em looked at me, and I nodded. Of course we would do this. We would be honored. If you don't mind, I said. And I direct this at Em too. She is the one you want in the plausible if there's an emergency. But I'd like to accompany you in the gift to see what it is like to actually ride in this thing. I think you have surpassed us at having the only ship of its kind in the whole galaxy. That would be excellent, Jay, the guide said. We would also like our first real voyage to be recorded, and human technology is much better for that than ours. I guess it's a good thing we lost the fur for now, Em said. I don't follow, the guide asked. We rather liked your fur. Yes, but our EVA suit designers didn't design with it in mind. Behind our guide, one of the Promethean engineers erupted in a fit of coughing laughter. We can see that, she said with a wide grin. The problems our suit people had with our own fur were considerable, so if your suits were designed for you to be naked, well, it's probably best to wear them that way.